And motion for this afternoon. Just kind of curious about how people found out about this. I'm going to go through several options, and when you say, "Yeah, that's how I learned about this," you put your hand up. Who saw the notice in the Manor Township in the MT Merchandiser? Merchandiser, very good. How about the Facebook social media event? We got a couple there. All right, I was responsible for that, crushing it. How about the Lancaster newspaper? Whoa, all right, subscribers, I love it, I love it, congratulations. How about the Lancaster County Historical Society, now known as Lancaster History? Just wait a minute, you don't even know what I'm going to say, Robinson, right? Vice President of Lancaster History. They have this slick community calendar where they let little scrappy historical societies put things onto their website and get broadcast out on their email. How many people read about it from the Lancaster History community calendar? Oh, this is great. And Mrs. Brembrook, did you hear about this from Corey?
Yeah.
All right. Corey, Liz Historical Foundation. Love it. Well, we're all in this together as a community. We all help each other. In case I forget later, thank you so much to the public library here and the staff for allowing us to be here and for helping us to do the PowerPoint presentation broadcast as well as via Zoom. So fingers crossed that that all works. And then also we'll be able to get this perhaps recorded and put on our YouTube site for the Manor Township Historical Society. I hope everybody knows where the restrooms are if you need to. Leroy says he's hoping that he's not going to put anybody to sleep. I doubt that anybody will. Not too many. All right. So if you see somebody dozing off, give them a little nudge. Remember back in the day, they used to have these people in church walking around with long poles. And if somebody was snoozing, they would tickle them with the feather on one end. The other end was what? Brass knob. Well, so, are we looking pretty good, Allie?
We're looking good.
We're looking good. All right.
So I have this set up so that you can see the slides and the computer's going to pick up the microphone for the Zoom.
Okay.
Do we need to test that at all?
I don't know that we have anyone else on Zoom to test
Okay.
it with, but as long as we don't get any feedback.
Okay. Well, we'll just, we won't get quite started until 1 o'clock because I know some people are we live with the Zoom meeting yet?
We are, yes.
Okay, all right. Let's just wait a moment or two, if you don't mind. It's great to see some young people here. Greetings. Glad you're all here. I'm not sure you brought the average age down too much, but you certainly did help. Yes, ma'am.
There's one more source of notification that maybe you didn't know about. Chaston Falls, who is our communication person, the casting class of 1961, sent out an email.
Chaz from the casting class of 1961 sent out an email. Who else received that email? Is that how you learned of this event?
Yeah, sort of.
I didn't receive it because I was just born in 1961. Oh, come on. Come on. I'm bringing the average age down a little bit. Although, Manor Township High School class of 1983, okay? 79. That's it. Sorry. Just thinking college. All right. I think we should go ahead and get started. All right, so let's open up that Zoom thing. Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Ben Weber. I'm the president of the Manheim Township Historical Society, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here to the Manheim Township Public Library. Thank you to the library staff and to the Board of Commissioners of the Township that allowed us to be here today. And also wanted to thank our speaker, Leroy Hopkins, for giving us another try, because apparently the last time we tried this, something happened.
Yeah, with COVID.
The COVID happened. But this is a great event. I've gotten to know Leroy over the last few years, and I'm just stunned with the knowledge that Leroy has, not only in the history of Lancaster County, but his particular interest in that of the people who came to live here, who were subject to the racism and the abuse over the years, the slaves as well as others who moved here, but then also has been researching and talking about the Underground Railroad, which was such a stunning source of hope and freedom and bravery in the very dark times that our country was living through. Today, I would like to also thank on behalf of the Manheim Township Historical Society, I'd like to welcome everyone here. And if you do get a chance to join us or support us by donation, please visit our website, Manheim Township historicalsociety.org, to find us, as well as to find find the recording of this on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Leroy, and then I'm going to try and advance the slides. But one of Leroy's other passions is the study of the language of German. So I ask you all to greet him with the appropriate saying of the daytime, which is Guten Tag. If you could all repeat after me, Guten Tag.
And I say, oh, Guten Tag, wie geht's? You say, Danke gut. Now, we're going to see a couple of slides, and then I'll try to read my manuscript to you and hopefully not put you too asleep. Afterwards, I'll entertain any questions you might have. Hopefully, you won't be like my college classes. No one has a question in college. This is the first of three talks. This one I term Slavery and the Emergence of Free African Communities. And the first picture is Underground Railroad we're going to talk about. And then we need two more slides. Who was involved? Oh, by the way, kudos to Randy Harris, who put this together for me. I'm all thumbs with computers. I know the information, but how to put it into a form. Free people of African descent, education advocates, temperance leaders, railroaders, and industrialists in our area. That's why it's called the Underground Railroad. Anti-Masons, Whigs, Republicans, and certain religious denominations. Next slide. Yeah, this goes into my talk. In glancing over the historiography of the African-American experience in Lancaster County, one set of texts from the year 1911 immediately draws notice to itself. The Lancaster County Historical Society organized a mini conference to celebrate what was then termed the Christiana Riot of 1851. Just as the society had done the year before, when the 200th anniversary of the first settlement of what is now Lancaster County was celebrated, 1911 was to be a reflection on events 60 years in the past. It is indicative of the mindset of that period that instead of the primary role played by Africans in fighting for their freedom, the papers to be delivered were to celebrate the role played by Quakers in the events near Christiana when slave owner Edward Gorsuch came from Baltimore County to reclaim fugitives from his plantation and found death instead. At a later date, I will discuss a paper given at that conference by Mariana Brubaker. Mariana Brubaker, step-grandmother of Jack Brubaker, the scribbler. And her paper is based on her personal perspective. Her father, Dr. Joseph Gibbons, and her grandfather, Daniel Gibbons of Bird in Hand, were major figures in the local campaign against slavery. For this session, I want to focus on a paper given in another context in 1911 by Miss Lottie M. Bousman titled "The General Position of Lancaster County in Negro Slavery." Miss Bousman, who was born in 1874, died 1959, was a recognized expert in genealogy and local history. Her bibliography of Lancaster County, the period covered is 1745 to 1912, is a standard reference work. In examining the institution of slavery in our country, she took what is humorously called the German historical approach, Plato to NATO, beginning with what she termed dim antiquity and mentioning the beginning of the European slave trade with Portugal's importation of Africans to Europe in the 1440s. She also states erroneously that the first enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown in 1619. In fact, the Africans whom Dutch sailors sold to the inhabitants of Jamestown were indentured servants. That is, after approximately 7 years of service, they were freedmen and were able to purchase other individuals themselves. It was not until 1641 that Massachusetts and then Virginia in 1661 passed laws enslaving Africans for life. The Pennsylvania story is rather fragmented in Miss Bousman's paper. The Germantown protests of 1688 and the Duke of York's ban of slavery, which was extended to Pennsylvania just before William Penn's acquisition of the land, are mentioned. Not mentioned is the presence of Dutch and Swedish settlers along the Delaware River in the 1630s and their use of Africans as laborers. Quaker Pennsylvania continued the practice of enslaving Africans. Yes, Quakers were major slaveholders. The Germantown protests of 1688 was directed against the Quakers and was dutifully ignored by them for over a century. The residents of Germantown were Mennonites who as tradesmen were concerned about competing with the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. Elsewhere, I have detailed the arrival of Samuel Blunston to the shore of the Susquehanna in 1726. There's an article that I wrote, I think in 1986, Black El Dorado and the Susquehanna, History of Blacks in Columbia. It appeared in the Journal of the Historical Society. Blunston, a surveyor for the Penns, came with a party that would eventually include Samuel Bethel and John Wright. The latter would name the county after his home, Lancashire, England. Their settlement became Columbia, and the decades before the Civil War, which we call the antebellum period, Columbia would be the urban center for Lancaster County's African population. The real value of Miss Bousman's essay is in her excerpting of the Gradual Abolition Act. Next slide. Passed in 1780, next slide. This is what it looked like. This act created a mechanism whereby slavery in the Commonwealth would be eliminated, but in a manner that was beneficial to the slaveholder. Show the next one. All Africans enslaved before March 1st, 1780 would be slaves for life. Their children born after that date were to be registered either at the local courthouse or in Philadelphia. Failure to do so resulted in their manumission, their freedom. This act is heralded as Pennsylvania's achievement, and Ms. Bousman notes, and I quote, "It is conceivable if each of the southern states had passed similar laws shortly after the Revolutionary War, following Pennsylvania's example, that slavery in the South would have been wiped out as peacefully as it was in our own state." Of course, she ignores the invention of the cotton gin, which made slavery more profitable. This statement is an oversimplification and ignores some of the problems inherent in the act, in the Gradual Abolition Act. First, why was the act passed? It is easy to assume it was an act of benevolence if one does not study other aspects of the period immediately before and after the Revolution. The American slave trade was part of a triangular trade. Ships from New England journeyed to Africa to buy captives taken in numerous skirmishes between Africans of the coast and the interior. These unfortunates were then shipped to the West Indies for seasoning. That is, they were brutalized and intimidated to make them useful as servants. Once seasoned, the now enslaved African was brought to one of the North American ports, such as Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, or New York, to be sold to the highest bidder. Sometime around 1760, Quaker merchants of Philadelphia decided to eliminate the middleman and bring Africans to Pennsylvania directly from Africa. This elicited an alarmist editorial by Christopher Sauer in his Germantowner Zeitung in 1763. He warned that in the Carolinas, Africans outnumbered whites 4-1, and colonists lived in constant fear of slave revolts. Sauer warned that increased importation of Africans into Pennsylvania would have the same effect. Perhaps in response to his fears, the Abolition Act was passed just 17 years later. But interestingly enough, none of the legislators from majority German areas, such as Lancaster County, voted for the law. And we can talk about that. Why were Germans opposed to slavery but didn't want to allow manumission? The 1780 Act had favorable clauses for slaveholders. The children of enslaved Africans would be made indentured servants, liable to serve up to the age of 28. Given African mortality rates at that time, that was a potential life sentence. Also, the act had a loophole. Slaveholders could take their pregnant slaves to a slave state and then return to legally claim the offspring as slaves for life. This loophole and an omission were corrected in an amended law in 1788. One of the problems was German farmers in the colony's southwestern region, was Allegheny County, believed that they were residents of Virginia and had not registered their enslaved workers. Although these problems were ameliorated, a problem remained. The original intent of the Abolition Act was to end slavery with a brief period of indentured servitude. After the children had served their term of service, all vestiges of slavery should have disappeared. That was the theory, but in practice, not only the children, but also the grandchildren of enslaved Africans were made indentured servants. Finally, in 1830, the state Supreme Court intervened to end the practice, noting it was never the intent of the original law to create a class of servants in perpetuity. But back to Ms. Bosman. She summarized her research by stating that, quote, figures for each decade in the census show that our county, in some cases, had more slaves than her sister counties, and that we belong to one of the last slave centers in the state. In other words, for the period from 1790 to 1840, the number of enslaved persons in Lancaster County declined from 384, there's a slide with that, 384 to 2. There's a twofold difficulty in ascertaining the number of those enslaved before 1780. It would be necessary to comb through all the public records of sales, wills, and indentures to ascertain who was enslaved and how many were manumitted between 1729 and 1780. It's much more expedient to examine the returns to the Gradual Abolition Act of 1780 to get a snapshot of slavery at that time. There's an incomplete copy of the returns to the Gradual Abolition Act at Lancaster History. I have done a study of Lancaster Borough. Of course, Lancaster was a borough until 1820 when it became a city, and found 47 slaveholders with 133 enslaved Africans reported as their property. This represented about 35% of the enslaved Africans living in Lancaster County, which in 1780 also included what would become Dauphin County a few years later. Excuse me. Among the slaveholders were Joseph Simon, founding member of the county's oldest Jewish synagogue, Jasper Yates, an attorney and a member of the state Supreme Court, Matthias Slough, proprietor of the White Swan Hotel, a German, John Musser, whose family had settled in Lancaster's southeast quadrant in the 1730s, and Colonel James Ross, Polly Ross, and George Ross Esquire, all members of the family of George Ross, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. How were these Africans used? We must assume they were both employed as domestics and or as workers in the businesses of the slaveholders. Samson Lazarus and Levi Andrew Levi were merchants, as were I'll say his name in German, Paul Zanziger, Joseph Simon, Matthias Slough, Christopher Crawford, Charles Hamilton, and Christian Wirtz. We can presume that their enslaved Africans worked in various aspects of those enterprises. We also find Christopher Reigert, a butcher, and John Hubley, the prothonotary, as slave owners. Perhaps the most interesting and detailed entry was made by William Parr and his wife, Grace. He is listed as a gentleman, and among his possessions we find, and I quote, Mary, 46, Jack, 24, child of Mary on board a vessel called Jolly Trooper, Captain or Commander Howell, Amelia, 22, Paul, 13, Sally, 7, Janet, girl of 3, all children of Mary and all slaves for life. Tom, 12, bound as apprentice to, name is missing, of Oxford Township, Pennsylvania, Philadelphia County, weaver until he arrives at the age of 21, property of William Parr. One man named Cato, 24, runaway and supposed to be gone to the enemy. Sable, 24, a cooper by trade, and now hired to fetter of the borough of Lancaster. Fanny, 14, bound until 18, and now living with Samuel Head, shopkeeper, Philadelphia, the property of Grace Parr, end of quote. From this one entry, we find that slavery in Lancaster intersected with other regions of Pennsylvania, and there was no age limit for slaves. Samson Lazarus owned Hannah, who in 1780 was 2.5 years old, the same age as Christian Wirtz's slave Bill. The question has been raised recently if Lancaster had a slave block. No traces of one has been found as of now, but transactions were conducted at the courthouse, and the newspapers of the period carried advertisements for the sale of Africans of both genders. And there's a slide showing that.
The next slide.
Sure. This is Robert Coleman of Elizabeth Township, the county of Lancaster, ironmaster, and it lists his property. Show the next one. That's the number enslaved. And then the next one. And this is from the Lancaster Journal, Friday, May 7th, 1819. And these were common. And this is William Hassan in Columbia. Slavery was never benevolent or an institution to which Africans acquiesced willingly. Prior to the Gradual Abolition Act, a number of Black codes existed which regulated the everyday life of enslaved and free Africans alike. A special order from King George III created a separate court to deal with Africans, and noted jurist A. Leon Higginbottom has enumerated in his study In the Matter of Color, Race in the American Legal Process, the Colonial Period, came out in 1978. He enumerates crimes for which whites were not punished, but Blacks were. A case in point here in Lancaster from 1770 is that of Tom, a free Black man, who cohabitated with an Irish maid. They had 2 children. Tom was punished, he was enslaved, and the children were sold. The Gradual Abolition Act nullified the codes, but did not remove the suspicion and distrust which those codes represented. The consequences would become apparent with the growth of the free African population. From the time of the revolution, it's possible to trace the development of communities of free Africans. Enslaved, most Africans had just one name, such as Mary, Pompey, or Caesar. The pastoral records, that's the next one. The pastoral records of St. James Episcopal Church and Trinity Lutheran document a decided change. Africans, for the first time, were owned by members of those congregations, and their names can be found in the pastoral records dealing with birth, baptism, marriage, and death. This is from St. James. Catherine, Jasper, and Sarah Yates were there at their baptism, and then some others listed there. And for the first time, they have full names. Whereas before they were known by a first name. There one finds references to Charles Butler, who married Charity Boyd at Trinity Lutheran Church on May 20th, 1797. Their daughter Caroline was baptized there on September 3rd, 1798. Similar entries can be found in St. James. A first sign of community organizing is found in the June 20th, 1817 edition of the Lancaster Journal. That's the next one. There it was reported that 50, you see it, at a meeting of about 50 people of color in and about Lancaster at the house of James Clendenin on the 10th day of June, 1817, it was resolved. And what they were doing is they wanted to set up their own church. And Clendenin and two others, Edward Burgess and Jeremiah Bullar, were chosen to contact the respectable citizens, members of St. James and Trinity Lutheran, to get permission to build a church and also support for its construction. Permission was obtained, but financial support was not. St. James and Trinity were at that time were rebuilding portions of their churches, so they did not have the extra money. As a consequence, the first years of the young congregation were difficult. In 1818, 2 sheriff's liens were issued against the congregation to cover a little over $400 for construction. Clendenin assumed responsibility, and in February 1821, Reverend Christian Endress, the pastor at Trinity, preached a dedicatory sermon for the new congregation. Now, where did Clendenin get this money from? He was a painter and a glazier. A painter, a glazier is someone who inserts window panes. Only the wealthy could afford to have glass windows. And so he was an intermediary between the majority and the minority community. It is debatable whether the community thus created was entirely free. In 1820, and that's the next slide, out of fear of acts of arson which had erupted in Harrisburg, this is where the African church is located. This is where I'm a member. I've been a member. My family's been a member for 3 generations. Church was organized in 1817. We just celebrated 205 years. So a registration law was passed in 1820 by the Select and Common Council, requiring all free persons of color entering or leaving Lancaster to register at the mayor's office. Failure to do so resulted in a daily fine of $1. Well, $1 in 1820 was a lot of money, a hefty fine. The resultant Negro entry book, that's the next slide. This is an article that appeared in the Journal of the County Historical Society. I discovered this entry book thanks to the late Jack Luce. In his book, Heritage of Lancaster, he mentions this. And my sister at that time worked at the county archives. I went there, I found the ordinance. I went to the Historical Society. The late John Ongst was the administrator. And I showed him the ordinance. I said, John, do you know anything about this? He looked at it. He said, we just got something. He went to his office. He had a desk that was this long and was piled up this high, literally. But he knew where everything was. He pulls out a book that's about this long. It was the returns to the entry book. And Jack was so kind to Xerox it for me. And I spent a year going over it. So if you want to read something interesting, look at the article on the entry book. The resultant Negro entry book is not only a guide to Lancaster's free African community, it contains almost 90% of the people of color listed in the 1820 census. It is also a measure of the control which the majority community wanted to exercise over an element which they considered at best a public nuisance. The entries document a nascent community which was diverse and distributed throughout Lancaster City. In 1820, 30 Africans lived in the households of Lancaster's white residents and were presumably employed as domestics. Another 169 reported the following places of residence. I'll go through these. Mussertown, 37. Mussertown, that's in the southeast. Water Street, 9. Orange Street, 18. Grovestown, 13. Alley behind Ober and Klein, 3. Prince Street, 37. Middle Street, 1. That's James Clendenin. South Queen Street, 17. Mulberry Street, 5. Adamstown, another part of the southeast, 9. East King Street, 2. Spring Garden, 14. That's Spring Garden was between Water and Charlotte Street. North Queen Street, 1, and the alley between West King and Orange, 6. Of the above, Mussertown, Adamstown, and Middle Street were in the southeast quadrant of the city. Spring Garden, located in the northwest quadrant, had a small settlement that included Isaac Gilmore's African Church, which existed from about 1822 to the 1850s, when it was supplanted by an African Union Church. The city's first directory, published in 1843, makes no reference to individual people of color, but does mention Isaac Gilmore's African Church and St. James African Church at Reigart's Landing. This latter reference is interesting. Excuse me. Reigart's Landing was at the foot of today's East Strawberry Street, and the church reference was the one created by the persons of color in 1817. Trustees of that church, led by George James, petitioned the Common School Board in October of 1839 to create an African school. A second petition was submitted in the 1840s, and from 1845 to 1854, Reverend Lewis Hood, a free African, was the teacher in the school. He's also probably the pastor who started the African Union Church in Spring Garden. An extraordinary document of Hood's success is found in a report by school director John Mathiot on the school that was published in the Lancaster Examiner and Herald on March 28, 1849. Key statements from that report are, and I quote, "This class of colored children read with distinctness and emphasis and proper modulation of voice, and in this respect would compare favorably with any class of white children in the schools. And whether the Black intellectually is inferior to the white race is a question not necessary at present to solve. It is, however, that the pupils of this school have made great progress in their studies, and if they possess the advantages enjoyed by white children of being transferred to higher schools as they advanced in their studies, would undoubtedly become good scholars," end of quote. For the time, these are revolutionary ideas and a counter narrative to the negativity usually found in 19th century Lancaster newspapers about Black residents. Is perhaps instructive that in the same year that this review was published, the trustees of the church, led again by George James, incorporated the church as the African Methodist Episcopal Church in Lancaster, perhaps a Declaration of Independence. In Columbia, contemporaneous to the events in Lancaster, a significant Black community evolved, nurtured by the influx of manumitted Africans from Virginia between 1819 and 1822. By 1850, this urban population reached 1,000, or almost 33% of the entire Black population of the county. By contrast, Lancaster had less than 400 residents. During the antebellum period, the pre-Civil War period, most Africans in Lancaster County lived in the rural areas of the Southwest and in the lower end. Only freed from the strictures of slavery by little over a generation, these free Africans would play an essential role in the struggle against slavery known as the Underground Railroad. An early leader of Columbia's Black community was Stephen Smith, who was brought to Columbia from Dauphin County by Colonel Thomas Bode, excuse me, who had bought him as an indentured servant about 1801. It belongs to the mythology of the Underground Railroad that Stephen Smith's mother escaped her master to join her son in Colombia, and when her master's daughter tried to retrieve her, she encountered resistance from Colombians incensed by the enslavement of a mother and the forced separation from her child. Many local historians have identified this early resistance to slavery as a beginning point of the local Underground Railroad activity. That cannot be verified, but it's significant that Stephen Smith was allowed to take charge of Bode's lumberyard and keep some of the profit. He was soon able to purchase his freedom, the freedom of his wife-to-be, a servant of the Mifflin family, and also the lumberyard. Stephen Smith's meteoric career in the business world ran parallel to a decided change in the anti-slavery campaign. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society, created in 1775 as a society for the relief of Negroes unlawfully held in bondage, expanded its charge after the passage of the Gradual Abolition Act to include, I quote, improving the condition of the African race. A local response to that mission was the creation of the Columbia Abolition Society in 1818. William Wright, grandson of John, was the president, and officers and members were residents of Columbia, Lancaster, and York. The society created Sabbath schools for free Africans, and when the 56 former slaves from Izard Bacon's plantation in Henrico County, Virginia, arrived in Columbia in 1819, they were placed under the care of the Columbia Abolition Society's acting committee. That group, plus two other groups who arrived in the next 2 years, formed the nucleus of Columbia's antebellum Black community. Churches and fraternity organizations were soon organized. Today's Mount Zion AME Church was organized almost contemporaneous with Lancaster's Bethel AME. A beneficial society or prototypical insurance company called the United Sons Beneficial Society appears on Columbia's tax list as a property owner and likely provided some support for its members. In 1852, Mount Horeb Lodge number 14, Free and Accepted Masons, was organized in Columbia and exists today in Lancaster. Small businesses were created, and men such as James Burrell, Stephen Smith, and Reverend Joshua P.B. Eddy began to accumulate wealth, a development that excited the anger of some Columbians. The result was a series of race riots beginning in August of 1834. The Columbia race riots occurred just 1 month after a similar riot in Philadelphia. In Columbia, after a night of looting and destruction, a meeting of so-called working men met and made several resolutions, one of which, a census was to be made of all the Black residents, and especially those who were property owners, with the aim of buying their property. Second resolution, white employers were to be encouraged not to hire Blacks for jobs which whites could do. And thirdly, Black residents were to be discouraged from harboring transients. Transient Blacks, Underground Railroad. The purpose of these resolutions was to eliminate Blacks as economic rivals. The census was conducted, but the rest of the resolutions were abject failures. There was no money available to buy Black-owned property, and the subsequent tax lists indicate that Black property ownership almost doubled. Reverend Joshua P. Eddy fled Columbia for Philadelphia, and the parents of Stephen Swales, that's the last slide. Stephen Swales, they were a interracial couple, that the wife was white, the father was Black. They moved to that safe haven of Mannheim. Yeah. In 1834. Another target of the mob, Stephen Smith, advertised his holdings for sale, but the size of his holdings precluded any idea of acquisition. At Lancaster's Rygart's Landing, again at the end of East Strawberry Street, for instance, reported holding 250,000 foot of lumber, which he wanted to sell. And of course, no one could buy it. No buyers were to be found. When Smith continued his practice of buying real estate and funding projects, he was actually a sort of a banker. A threat elicited support for him from Colombia's first family, the Wright family, Wright with a W, who were the Wright family, announced that attacks against him were also directed at them because he was their business partner. Some sources erroneously state that after the riots that Stephen Smith left Colombia, ostensibly because of ill feelings against him. The truth is, in 1830, he had been ordained an elder in the AME church. And due to his wealth, in the 1850s, he was earning $50,000 a year. And because of his wealth, his presence in Philadelphia, the headquarters of the AME church, was desired. In 1841, Stephen Smith announced the creation of a new company, Smith and Whipper, and his partner, William Whipper, assumed responsibility for the company's operations in Colombia, where Whipper had lived since at least 1837. When William Still published the first account of the Underground Railroad in 1872, only William Whipper recounts the semi-clandestine activities in Colombia. This is significant because after 1850, William Still had been the key operative of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society's Vigilance Committee, which cared for the freedom seekers who entered Philadelphia. Colombia, which many sources identify as the most important nexus of the Underground Railroad in Pennsylvania, had William Whipper as its most important station master. Whipper's letter to Still, published in Still's book, outlines the difficulties which supporters of the freedom seekers faced in Colombia. Attempts to destroy his lumberyard and national events such as the Dred Scott decision of 1857 have persuaded Whipper that racial hatred in the US would never end. So he was poised to join his sister in Ontario when the Civil War erupted and he decided to stay. He supported the Union financially, and Black Colombians rushed to the new US colored troop units. Stephen Swales, who spent his early years in Mannheim, joined the Massachusetts 54th Volunteers in 1863 and was the first African-American promoted to a commissioned rank despite opposition from his superiors. The Civil War marked a high point in local Black development. Over 300 Black Lancastrians went to war to support the Union and to end slavery. It seems clear that they also hoped to improve their own status and that of their children. Their failure to achieve that goal is documented in the fact that the county's Black population of 3,650 in 1860 dwindled to less than 2,400 in 1900. A survey conducted by the State Department of Welfare in 1925 found 2,000 Blacks living in Lancaster City, which was now the new urban center for Blacks. But of that number, of that 2,000, only 37% were native born. Lack of opportunity was compelling local Blacks to seek their fortunes elsewhere well into the 20th century. Thank you. Now, if you have any questions, I'd be glad to entertain them.
What were the riots in Colombia?
The race riots,
Okay, so who was rioting?
probably Germans, because Colombia was settled primarily by Germans. And it had to do with, there was a conflict over, if you look at there's a book called Men of Standing. It was published 30 years ago. Those who were in favor of colonization. The Pennsylvania Abolition Society evolved into the American Colonization Society. It was organized January 1st, 1817. And they decided that the best way to solve the race question was to send all Blacks back to Africa. And of course, this was not greeted with any sort of acceptance by Blacks. There was a meeting at Mother Bethel in March of 1817. And so the colonizationists wanted everyone out, everyone Black out. 1830, William Lloyd Garrison begins the Liberator. He's one of the radical abolitionists. They want to end slavery right then. No thought of what happens to the enslaved. And so the conflict between those two forces probably led to the race riots in Colombia. I didn't mention in my article that I wrote about Colombia, but in the Lancaster newspaper in July of 1834, there's a report about the race riots in Philadelphia. And they said that these are deplorable, but they were understandable because of the desire to amalgamate. Amalgamation was the mixing of the races. Next to that story are two letters, supposed letters, to the Liberator. One is from a supposedly Black person named Bandy Pump, who's advertising for the daughter of an abolitionist. He would like to marry her. And the other is from an abolitionist who's offering his daughter for marriage to a Black person. A week later, we have race riots in Colombia. Not just one, there were 3 or 4 of them. And it was unfortunate, but it was predictable that it would happen. And it was mainly envy, jealousy, because, well, we have the same jealousy operating today. The groups that are saying we will not be replaced. Democrats are letting the immigrants in. They're taking over from us. And also there's some resentment of Blacks succeeding because of this fear of replacement. It's not new. It was here 150 years ago. Other question.
As you get a question, if you could repeat it back so that people
okay,
on
sure.
Zoom can hear it.
Sure. It had to do with, that question had to do with the race riots. Why?
The 2 questions, just to clarify about the race riots, that means that whites attacking Blacks.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yes, a race riot in this case
Not
meant,
Blacks. I mean, when you say
No.
race riots, it almost sounds like Black people are involved.
Yeah.
But
and actually the thing is, the only time that there have been Blacks attacking whites, Nat Turner, and he was a free person, and he was inciting the enslaved Africans to revolt. Most race riots in American history have been whites attacking Blacks.
the question about names, is the fact that you said that, well, I knew that enslaved people only had one name. So I have a question about how they acquired the last name, the family names. Were they able to choose? Show the baptismal record at St. James? Did they automatically take the name of their enslaver, or were they able to choose a last name?
The question is, how did Africans choose their names? And they had full names. We really don't know. In some cases, they took the name of someone they admired. It sounds a little funny, but I've never met anyone white named Washington. But sometimes they took a name like John Freeman because they were free. But there is no, I don't think anyone's ever been able to document how they came about their names.
Isn't it true that some acquire the name of their enslaver?
Oh, yes, yes. But only if the enslaver was benevolent, and most of them weren't. Sometimes they would take another name. For example, we were almost certain that Thomas Jefferson had children with Sally Hemings, but the offspring were not named Jefferson. They were named Woodson. Carter G may have been a descendant of Thomas Jefferson.
The Underground Railroad, is it a spontaneous thing? Is it organized, planned?
It's a good question. The question is, the Underground Railroad, was it organized or was it spontaneous? Yes and yes. The real heroes of the Underground Railroad are those who are fleeing, because there was no organization. Now, there were people who were organized. They were usually connected because of family or because of faith. I mentioned Daniel Gibbons. Daniel Gibbons is related through marriage to William Wright in Adams County, and William Wright in Adams County is the cousin of William Wright in Columbia. So they would pass from family to family. But other than that, it was just word of mouth. Follow the gourd, go north, follow the moss. The real heroes are the people who escaped because they had no guarantee that the person they were going to meet was going to help them. And the reason why Blacks played a role is that you're a fugitive slave and you come to, and you meet a white person, you're going to say, hi, I just escaped from the South. Can you help me? No. You look for someone who looked like you. But even that was dangerous because some Blacks were used as spies to turn them in because they got paid.
First of all, thank you for all your great work. I'm curious about the following. How the students, college and respond to all this knowledge? Because I think for us minorities, things haven't changed so much in certain
No.
way. Now it's legal to, but the changes are not. MAG and all that stuff, so
Yeah.
how your students respond really?
Well, the question is, how did my students, or how do young African Americans today respond to this? Usually positively, but of course, I taught German. I didn't teach history. And so I talked about this a little bit in the last years of my career. I taught courses on multicultural Germany. How many of you are familiar with the fact that there are Afro-Germans? They call themselves Afro-Deutsche. There's about anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million of them. And they are the children of the descendants of Africans or African Americans and Germans. And they went through their own civil rights period. A book came out in 1985 called Farbe Bekennen, which was translated in 1992 to Showing Our Colors, Afro-German Women Speak Out. And for the students in those classes, it was not just an eye-opener, it was something that they really were fascinated with. The idea that in other cultures, it's the same problem. People are human everywhere. And they have the same difficulties, they run the same sort of racism. I lived in Germany for 10 years. My ex-wife is German. And X is small letters because we were planning to get married again, but she has health problems. But when I moved to Germany in 1972, I lived there from 72 to 76. In 1973, I had an opportunity to teach German at the Drake Edwards Concern for the 3rd Armored Division. So I moved to Frankfurt. I had no place to stay. I spent the first week almost on the street. And I get the newspaper. There was an apartment for rent. I'd call and they say, yes, the apartment's available. 5 minutes later, I knock on the door. They open the door. Ich bin wegen des Zimmers gekommen. I came because of the room. Oh, we just rented it. I knew that was the problem. But on the other hand, as much as I ran into that, you found the exact opposite. That also happened. Pat?
Leroy, should we kind enough to preview the next 2 talks so that people here will be aware of what's coming up?
If I can remember what the next 2 talks are. One is on update on the Underground Railroad, some new sites, and the other is a look at the historiography. Who wrote what about the Underground Railroad? It's a fascinating topic. It's a basic American story. Americans like to help the underdog, so therefore everyone has a area somewhere. Fugitives were hidden here. I helped them escape. In Lancaster County, any structure that's over 100 years old and has a hidden space, there were fugitive slaves in there. It's a great story.
Leroy. So I wanted to let people who are on the Zoom meeting know that if they wanted to type in a question via the chat, please go ahead and do so. Then we'll hear from the staff that there's a question. It'll be read and then we'll proceed. But let's keep going with the questions of people in the room.
Question here, question there, question there. Okay.
I've been told that the house where I grew up in Morristown was part of the Underground Railroad. Is there some official way that I can make sure that's
The question is to the house on Roarstown.
2108 Marietta Avenue?
Don't tell them, they come to visit you. So there's a nice house at that address you want to go. The question is, if you have a house that you suspect may have been on the Underground Railroad, how do you go about verifying that? It's chancy. You have to look for documentation, but in most cases, people didn't write it down. William Still was an exception. He kept the records because the committee that employed him said, we want you to keep records. They meant of the money. He kept records of everyone who came in their stories. He had to hide it because if he had been caught, he would have gone to jail. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act said that if you did not help the authorities to secure a fugitive, you could spend a year in jail, $1,000 fine. Well, $1,000 fine, if you couldn't pay it, you end up in the almshouse, which was a life sentence. So it was dangerous to keep that information. And you also have to look for stories. You can find someone who said they stayed at this house. I'm involved with the creation of the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith Center, which is being run by Lancaster History. And we have a story, O.C. Kelly, was that his name? O.C. Kelly? No, O.C. Gilbert. His name was Kelly before he became Gilbert. He actually lectured and talked about going to Thaddeus Stevens' office. That story was picked up in one of the early stories, and I'll talk about that the next time, Smedley, Robert Smedley. But most of the information about the Underground Railroad was gathered 50 and more years after the fact. Now, I just turned 80 yesterday. If someone asked me about something, if someone asked me about something that happened when I was 30, it might be a little vague. So when Smedley comes around in 1883 and asks about things that happened in the 1820s and 1830s, and also, how many of you have been involved in events? Every time you tell it, it gets a little better. You know, it's a little better. Yeah, so it's chancy. The term mulatto, where does it come from? Actually, it's from the Spanish. It's actually mule. A mule is created by two different groups. So it's someone that has different characteristics as a white and black. For example, I would be characterized as mulatto because my great grandparents, their names were John and Susan Sechrist Warner. And they were probably German. And they settled, well, I can't find them before 1830. They settled in Conestoga. And even though they were German, they were co-founders of an AME church. Now, I gave a talk or two talks last November to the German Society of Pennsylvania about the relations between African Americans and Germans. And the second talk, I talked about locally. And I mentioned my mother. My mother said words that I didn't understand until I started taking German. For example, hair bun, my mother called that a dut. How many of you know that word, dut? A dut is hair bun in German. And there are other words, and I didn't know that until I actually started German. I started German in 10th grade. And so there was, that's the mixture. In terms of, you look at statistics, between 1790 and 1820, the Black population in this country increased by 260%. Of that, 3/5 were mulatto. And well, you know where that comes from. Another question? Mm-hmm.
There was some discussion about the Columbia riots. Is it accurate that for the most part, blacks and whites were very amicable in Columbia?
Yes and no. I have an article that's coming out probably next month on Black entrepreneurs. This year is the 150th anniversary of the County Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And I was asked to write an article about Black business. And I covered the period 1780. That quote I gave you about William Parr, that's in it, up to 2000. And one of the things that happened in Columbia, Columbia was the urban center before the Civil War. But when William Whipper, Stephen Smith, and Joshua P.B. Eddy, and James Burrell left, it went downhill. So that in the 1880s, 1890s, a pastor by the name of William Thurston came to be the pastor at Mount Zion AME Church. And people were living in poverty. Blacks were living in poverty. And he talked to the local employers and said, can you help us? And they said, we can't, because if we hire blacks, our white workers won't work with them. So that was that problem in Columbia. And so a silk mill was created. It only lasted 2 years. It was then moved to Fayetteville, North Carolina. And so the problem has been there. Now, today is different. This is another 100 years later. The Klan has never been that very active in Colombia for good reason. Whites and blacks would fight against them. But you have to look at where hate groups are active. I hope no one's here from the southern end. Quarryville is one of the places. The headquarters of the Klan and the neo-Nazis is in Rising Sun, Maryland. They have a website. You go look at it.
We have a question from the Zoom.
Okay.
Are you aware of any tours in Lancaster County of major sites related to the Underground Railroad?
Yes, as a matter of fact, one is taking place now. Randy Harris, I don't have his contact information. I give it to the Historical Society. Randy does tours in conjunction with Lancaster History.
Sure, I think people didn't hear the question.
Oh, the question is, are there any major tours of the Underground Railroad? One of the things that's coming up in October, I think it's October 23rd, we're going to have an Underground Railroad tour in Columbia. It's co-sponsored by Mennonite Life, it used to be Mennonite Historical Society, and the African American Historical Society, of which I'm past president. And last year we had 70 people show up. And Columbia is a very interesting borough to visit. There's a lot of history there. There's a lot of history all over Lancaster. Lancaster is a very historic county.
Two questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
One, you mentioned early in your talk about the gradual abolition law and how there were some in Lancaster who were, well, I think you said supportive, but not willing to stand up.
Oh, yes.
Could
Yeah.
you
Well,
touch base on that?
Well, it has to do with the German attitude towards slavery. One of the things that the Germans believe, especially pietists, they believe that God created the world. Slavery is of the world. So therefore, changing the status is wrong, it's a sin. But what you do is you prepare the enslaved person for the afterlife, which is, of course, no consolation for the persons enslaved. Moravians, Count Zinzendorf, who was the head of the Moravians, was challenged because he was accused of fomenting rebellion among blacks. The Moravians targeted enslaved Africans and Native Americans. And his response is, oh, no, we trained them to be better servants. When Muhlenberg came to the New World in 1740, I've read his journal. He was the patriarch of the Lutheran Church. He went to South Carolina and was very upset, not that there were slaves, but because the slaveholders were not teaching them to read the Bible, because reading the Bible prepares you for the afterlife. He wasn't upset. He came to our area, met his son Peter, and he describes that Peter came with his 2 African slaves.
I had another question, something I didn't quite follow. You were talking about Stephen Smith, and I think you said that he had purchased his own freedom?
He was an indentured servant.
Indentured servant, okay. So people who were indentured servants could still earn money on their own.
Some of them could.
Some of them could, depending on the contract under which they were indentured.
And see, at the last Columbia tour, we met, or at least I met, a descendant of the Bode family. Thomas Bode was a member of St. James. He was a hero from the Revolutionary War. And the story in the family, or at least the tradition, is that Stephen Smith was probably Thomas Bode's son, which might explain why he was so liberal with him. But that was not true of all. If you were an indentured servant, your time could be sold to someone else. But by law, you had to be free after 28 years of service. You couldn't serve for more than 28 years. But if you only lived to be 40, that was no consolation.
Right. In wrap up do you mind, Leroy, explaining what your part 2 and part 3 might be about to sort of help people?
I just did.
Oh, you did?
I just
Okay, I'm
did.
sorry.
That's okay. No,
I must have been focused on those 4 Zoom people, so sorry.
well, to reiterate that, I'm going to talk about a new perspective on the Underground Railroad, try to find some new sites. And the other is just look at the historiography. I just bought a book called The Underground Railroad that was published in 1860. It's written by a Black minister who was himself enslaved in North Carolina. And I found out about it by reading Smedley's Underground Railroad in Chester and surrounding counties, which came out in 1883. What's interesting is Smedley died before the book could appear. And the people who edited it and published it were Marianna Brubaker, who I mentioned, and Robert Purvis, who was himself a mulatto from South Carolina. I think there was one other question. Mhm.
Could you clarify 1619 at Jamestown and the ship that came?
Sure.
According to the 1619 project, Nicole had done, I thought they were the first arrival of Africans who were enslaved, but did you say they were indentured?
They were indentured. I would recommend reading Timothy Breen, his book, My Own Ground. In My Own Ground, he talks about a family named Johnson who were free. They came 1619. Within 7 years, they were free. They bought their own servants. And so it's erroneous to look at that, because the thing is, if they were enslaved, why do they have to pass a law making African slaves for life 50 years later? It doesn't make any sense. Massachusetts in 1641, they made slavery an institution that lasted the entire life of the person. And in 1661 in Virginia, well, if the 1619 Africans are enslaved, why do you need this law later? Just common sense.
They were brought against their will, obviously.
Oh, sure. But against their will, Germans came, they were called redemptioners. They sold their time and also they had to pay their passage. So they would sell their time, and after they were free, then they could prosper. The only problem with the Africans who were enslaved or indentured, after they were free, were they really free? They couldn't start businesses necessarily. They were not allowed to do certain things. So they, it's a two-edged sword.
What's the article on the Negro entry book?
It's called the Negro Entry Book.
And by?
By me.
Okay. Thank you.
If you go to the Journal of the Lancaster County Historical Society, I have 11 articles in there. The 12th will be the one on business. And I started, I think, 1984, a prolegomena on Bethel AME Church, an attempt at a social history. That's my first article. And continue with the one on business. Mhm.
Are there still many African Americans in this area that would have ties to that era and maybe like family, like oral histories of that time period?
Sure. I have my mother's family Bible, and the first birth date is 1777. And that's on my mother's side. On my mother's father's side, I can go back to Cupid Paca or Cupid Pico or Cupid Peaker, who lived from 1777 to 1847 in Harford County, Maryland. If you go to Harford County, go right down 222, go across Conowingo, you come up, Darlington is on the left, Castleton Road, you go down 2324 Castleton Road. In 1822, Cupid Paca bought 50 acres of land and paid $700 cash for it. And he's described in a local history as a shoemaker, stonemason, and land speculator. Never enslaved, he bought the freedom of his wife-to-be. Her name was Nancy Prigg. And this sort of historical. I think her owner was Joseph Prigg, Dr. Joseph Prigg, who was a doctor in Havre de Grace. Joseph Prigg's brother is Edward Prigg. And if you read the entry that William Whipper wrote to William Still, he says that the activity reached its high point after the Prigg case. Edward Prigg in the 1830s was commissioned by a neighbor to go to York County and kidnap a woman that his neighbor said was a runaway slave. He kidnapped her. It was then sued for kidnapping. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. He was exonerated, but the result of the decision from the Supreme Court was that the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, the fugitive slaves they're not mentioned by name in the Constitution, but fugitives from labor, that's a slave. It said it was valid, but it was not up to the state to enforce. The federal government had to enforce. After that, people rushed to Pennsylvania because we had freedom laws. And so that was the high point of the Underground Railroad.
In deference to your 80-year-old knees.
Yes. Can I sit down and answer?
Yeah, okay. If you're okay to do that, that'd be great. Just hang on just a second.
The one knee is only 1 year old, but this one's.
Why don't we suspend the Zoom meetings so that we don't have to worry about the audio visual? Thank you for everyone chiming in. We're going to stop recording and wish you all well, but Leroy's going to hang out here and answer a few more questions.
I'm elated, no one's asleep.